Hello and welcome to the Arms Control Poseur podcast. My name is William Alpert, Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. I will be your host as we explore the world of arms control. On each podcast, I will interview the great and the good of the arms control community about a current event related to a treaty or agreement, past, present, or only proposed. Then together we will go, hopefully, deep enough on the history and functioning of the agreement to help you make sense of it all. And, well, that's the idea anyway. This podcast is funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. Now let's get underway. And now on with the show. Today, I have a very special episode for you, the third of 3 episodes on women, peace, and security, each featuring one of 3 different guests from the Vienna Centre for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. In this third episode, I will discuss gender perspectives in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, focusing on the gendered impact of weapons, with our special guest, Federica Dall'Arche, a senior research associate at the VCDNP. We are also joined by 2 of her colleagues, Louis Reitmann, a research associate.
Hi, it's good to be back on the podcast.
And Mara Zarka, research associate and project manager.
Hello, William.
Both also from VCDNP. Federica, welcome to the show.
Hi, William. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for being on here today. So tell me, we've got 2 very closely related topics here. Can you tell me then about gender perspectives on arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament, and gender impacts?
Sure. Would love that. So usually in my research, when I analyze arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament and gender perspectives, I look at 2 different elements. One is women participation in negotiating processes, but we've already analyzed that during another episode featuring Mara Zarka. So I highly encourage our listeners to look at that podcast as well. But another element that I usually look at is the gendered impact of weapons. And I always like to talk about this second element because it helps me diffuse that hideous idea that gender studies in arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament are irrelevant. Or even worse, that they are only aimed at protecting women's rights, putting men's rights and men's needs, say, in a corner or on a side. So I hope that you learn during this podcast and during the other 2 podcasts that we've recorded with also Louis Reitmann, that this is really not the case. So how are gender analysis and arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament related? Well, first of all, let me give you a very brief but necessary preliminary distinction. When we talk about gender, we talk about a social construct. So characteristics, norms, behaviors, roles, rules, that society assigns to women, men, girls, and boys. So boys like blue, women and girls like pink. Boys are strong, women are weak. When we talk about sex, we actually are talking about different biological and physiological characteristics that females, males, and intersex people have, such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. So why is this distinction important? Because a lot of an increasing and overwhelming number of studies are now demonstrating how both sex and gender can enormously influence the likelihood of being targeted by weapon systems and chances of becoming a victim or survivor of armed violence, the effects produced by these weapons that can also be long-lasting effects, as well as the ability to access medical care in the aftermath of an attack.
So I recall I was specifically challenged by a senior official at an organization I used to work for who said the whole idea of gendered impacts of weapons of mass destruction, or small arms light weapons seemed ridiculous to him. That, a weapon is a weapon and a weapon effect is a weapon effect. Blast effects, radiation, chemical, biological are all the same. So how would you argue back? What are the examples of a gendered impact of weapon systems?
Well, I'm so glad you asked because, yes, theoretically, a weapon is a weapon, right? And technically, if we are talking about weapons of mass destruction, we can even go as far as saying that they are democratic weapons because they do not discriminate according to gender, age, sex, or whatever, right? But in reality, we know that this is not the case. And I'm very happy to give you some examples. An immediate example of the differentiated or gendered impact of weapons is reported, for instance, by the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, the ICBL, which shows that actually men and boys represent 85% of all the victims of explosive devices left on territories following an armed attack. And this happens mainly due to strict gender norms and rules that in some societies still see men as breadwinners and impose women limited access to public spaces outside the domestic context. And by the same token, because men are seen as stronger and braver, they are usually the majority of individuals who are involved, for instance, in the mining efforts. But another interesting example relates to the use of artificial intelligence in weapon systems. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard about instances of gender bias and discrimination in systems using artificial intelligence for civilian purposes, especially when it comes to hiring processes, for instance. Studies have demonstrated that certain individuals were automatically disqualified by automatic screening processes because of their name, and the assumption that these processes, this artificial intelligence, had based on their name, assuming a potential race or sex associated to the name. So now new research is actually exposing how military applications of artificial intelligence might also be affected by built-in biases, making the use of these systems particularly controversial. For example,
How is that?
Let me tell you. Human Rights Watch describes how target profiling based on gender differences have been widely used in semi-autonomous weapons, for instance, armed drones, to specifically target people resembling aged men. So if you're a middle-aged man, potentially with a beard, your chances of being targeted by this drone are way higher. So my suggestion is...
Wow, so I got to shave, huh?
Yeah,
Oh, man.
it's terrible.
Oh, no.
And obviously, these biases are problematic because, they also blur the distinction between civilians and soldiers. But this is also an example to you to demonstrate how really applying a gender lens in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament is not as crazy because, as you can see, there are different impacts. And these are just two of them, but I'll be happy to explore more with you if you would like.
Yeah, I really would. Because this is a really interesting question, because now, so far, you've given me two examples. One, landmines that you said disproportionately kill or injure men, and then how artificial intelligence targeting can, just like, I suppose this goes back to counterterrorism. During the big wave of state-sponsored terror in the 1980s, there was a case where a terrorist gave his girlfriend a bomb to bring on a plane, and it took the plane down and killed her as well, because guards just didn't think it was worth searching women. They searched the men. So it sounds similar with artificial intelligence overwhelmingly targeting men, because it would not see women as the same level of threat. Both of which are very, very interesting, but both of which seem to indicate that men are the on the danger side, on the receiving side of the negative effects of weapon systems here, which seems pretty intuitive, that most men die in wars and things like that. But is there a gendered issue here in terms of the risks and vulnerabilities of women to weapons or to weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sit tight because I have way more examples for you.
Excellent. All right, let's get to it.
So, for instance, another example of how men and women are disproportionately affected by weapons, and this time due to biological differences, so I'm referring to sex, is reported by UNIDIR, which demonstrates how men are more prone to develop okay, you have to sit tight in this case too, because it's difficult for me to pronounce this word, but neurodegenerative disorder. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation.
Yeah. Neurodegenerative disorder.
Neurodegenerative disorders.
Yeah, as in neurons.
There you go. Following chemical and biological attacks. Whereas women record greater long-term effects that affect their reproductive health, leading to perinatal death, spontaneous abortion, and birth defects. Similar findings actually concern the effects of exposure to radioactive material. A study conducted by the International Law and Policy Institute, ILPI, on the effects of radioactivity released from nuclear power plant accidents, so for instance, Chernobyl, nuclear testing, so for instance, those conducted in the Marshall Islands, or nuclear weapons use, so obviously we're referring to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this case. So this study found out that ionizing radiation has disproportionate effects on both sexes, causing almost twice as many cancer incidents in women than in men. And this result is due to the metabolic differences between men and women and the fact that women have 50% more high-risk body tissues, such as sensitive reproductive and fatty tissues.
That makes sense. Okay.
But then there's another final example that I would like to explore with you before I give you the mic back. And this relates to the barriers to health and medical access following an armed attack, whether it is with biological weapons, chemical weapons, or conventional weapons, or nuclear weapons. And I think in this case, the Syrian case is a particularly difficult one to digest. So we talked, and you correctly said that weapons are, don't really make a distinction. Weapons are weapons. They are just instruments and tools. But an incredible project led by Global Public Policy Institute, which I highly recommend everybody to look at, a project that was supported by the government of Canada, government of Germany, among others, analyzed the impact of chemical weapons attacks in Syria starting in 2012. And this project has shown that the female death rate following chemical weapons attacks was almost twice as high that of men.
Wow.
And why?
Yeah, why?
You know why?
No.
This was mainly due to gender norms and the greater obstacles encountered by women in accessing medical care. So, as a matter of fact, cultural context and social norms made it particularly difficult in that situation to quickly activate the health practices that are necessary following a chemical attack. So technically, after a chemical attack, the victim needs to be completely wash off, so they need to be completely undressed, and the chemical agents need to be completely washed off. But in some cases, this was not possible because in certain contexts, women cannot be seen by other men other than their husband, right? Even if they are medical personnel.
Even in medical circumstances.
Even in medical circumstances. And this is incredible if you think about it. And so this was one of the reasons why the number of women who died in this case was way higher.
Wow. And especially with chemical weapons, when you're talking about a mass contamination incident or a radiological incident where, the rapid removal of all clothing and washing is the most important factor in terms of survival. If that's against, your local cultural norm, you're going to see enormous differences in casualties. That's really extraordinary.
Yeah, there's also might be, distrust in medical personnel. There are different causes here, but the study also shows that medical personnel and health professionals in some cases also lack proper knowledge about specific male health needs. So I'm talking about reproductive health, for instance. And so these also played a role in higher female mortality rate. And this is extremely sad. But this is not the only case. Stereotypes, stigma, discriminations, which are a direct product of gender norms and rules, can also contribute to unfair access to medical care. And again, this is not only a women problem. This doesn't only apply to women. Let me give you another example. Men and boys who, by virtue of rigid notions of masculinity, often refuse to undergo therapy or accept medical care, even after being hit by a landmine. Can you believe this?
Right.
Or women survivors of gender-based violence, for instance. We know that gender-based violence, rape is often used as a weapon of war, right?
Right.
But Even
Right.
the step of accepting or having to say that they were women or victim of gender-based violence can be problematic and difficult. And so in some cases, women do not look for medical assistance because of fear of discrimination. So this applies also to victims of weapons with gender identities that are not corresponding to the sex assigned to them at birth, or with different sexual orientations, which often decide to not undergo medical treatment or not to have medical help due to the fear of being discriminated. Or even more problematic, they are not provided with or offered proper medical care because their needs are considered second class or less urgent. And I'm referring, for instance, to those people who are undergoing hormone treatments for sex transition. And as you can see, these barriers to healthcare can result in serious psychological implications, also negatively affecting victim mental health. They can also lead to the death of victims.
Right. No, I take your point as well on the very purpose often of using rape as a weapon in war is because of the stigma, is because you are attempting to, annihilate these women's identity and role within their societies. So it absolutely makes sense that there would be an impact there. And I mean, let's face it, not just for women as well. Gender is also, rape is also used as a weapon war against men, similarly for the humiliation and children as well. Yeah, for the horrifying knock-on effects that'll have. I think that is a very good place to break, pause, take a breath. When we return, I'm William Alpert, speaking to Federica Dall'Arche. You're listening to the Arms Control Poseur podcast. Wow. This is a lot as a topic. I don't really know where to go from here. What else can you tell me? Is there anything else that we can do about this? Is there any way to address these issues?
I'm just giving you some examples because I think these are very important, and especially the barriers to medical access and healthcare.
Right.
They can result in serious psychological implications that negatively affect victims' mental health. But where can we go from here? What can we do? Oh, there's so much we can do, actually. And the very first step is probably to sponsor studies that uncover these differences. Historically, medical studies in general and studies on the effects of weapons and WMDs agents specifically, by default have been conducted on male bodies, leaving out important and different results that could emerge from medical studies carried out on female bodies. As a result, it is difficult to assess true female-specific medical implications and risks, and this ultimately hinders a fair and universal access to appropriate medical care. Think about COVID-19, for instance. We know that recent studies have uncovered how COVID-19 had different levels of morbidity and mortality among men and women. So it is important that these studies are conducted. We've talked with Mara about the WPS agenda and the fact that, we know that conflicts in general have a different impact on men, women, and all parties involved. But these studies on the effects of weapons are relatively new. And so that's why it's important that they are carried out and more funds are dedicated to this. And then it goes without saying, and it's related to my previous point, education on these issues. Education on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, education on gender issues, on their intersection, so that whoever is tasked with negotiating treaties and peace agreements do so with a more inclusive, educated, and sensitive negotiation approach that can lead to the adoption of more complete, effective, and therefore sustainable agreements and treaty. If you think about it, all these 3 treaties have gender provisions into them, and they are the Cluster Munition Convention, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is crazy. And then the last thing that I would say with the risk of sounding like a broken record. But we need to break stereotypes and facilitate equal opportunities and diverse participation for everybody, but also meaningful participation, because as we've said with Mara and Lewis in other podcasts, participation does not equal meaningful participation. So it is important to have quotas, it is important to give women and minorities equal opportunities, but we need to make sure that whoever covers leading and decision-making positions is actually advocating for universal rights and is actually advocating for the protection of everybody's needs. What else can I say? I think it's important to provide training and capacity buildings that can educate anyone, both men, women, and others, on gender issues, providing the necessary skill, knowledge, and confidence to effectively advocate for everybody's rights and needs. But then at the governmental level, maybe it's important to adopt policies that address gender-based discriminations and ensure equal access to opportunities. And again, we talked about this during our podcast with Mara, but just even implementing family policies that allow women to remain in a field is extremely important. And then monitor implementation of agreements and commitments, you name it. I think these are some of the examples of steps that can be taken. But first and foremost, I think that more resources should be put into this field.
Well, it also strikes me that one thing that absolutely should be done as a matter of priority is more training for medical personnel to try to break down this idea of gendered medical care. That strikes me as truly outrageous. When you think about where chemical weapons are being used on a regular basis, we need to train people to say, look, you've got to save these lives. There's steps you need to take, and I don't care about. Honestly, I don't care about whatever cultural norm you have. If you're not going to save a life, that's absolutely ridiculous. That's a violation of every medical practitioner's core value of human life is human life, and you have to protect it. And especially again with radiological or chemical incidents, speed of care, and whether that means removing and burning their clothing, fine. Like, develop a protocol to handle that, but just bloody well train and do it. So I guess we need more training, more exercising those types of trainings, because there are even conventional weapons like phosphorus or napalm or other weapons where, you've got to care. Time is of the essence.
Right. And I think besides the training of the medical personnel, because you're absolutely right, and I 100% agree with you. I think it's also a bipartisan problem. I mean, certain women just didn't want to be seen naked, and that's a cultural thing that needs to be challenged.
Yeah. Right, and there are other cultures. I mean, I'm aware, like in the Japanese culture, to be a victim is stigmatizing, and so you have issues there around self-reporting and things like that. But Louis, you have a perspective to bring here. Talk to us.
I wanted to first of all underline what Federica said about the importance of thinking a little bit further than the worst case, right? So when we talk about nuclear weapons specifically, I think the conversation often ends at that point when we contemplate the possible use of nuclear weapons, and understandably so. We maybe don't want to, I think it's in human nature that we don't want to contemplate the truly horrific effects of a nuclear weapon being used. But it is important to think about the long-term effects of nuclear weapons use because they're different for men and women, and I would say they're far worse for women. Federica mentioned several examples. There are birth defects, but also cancer that women can develop just because they have more of that tissue that can be exposed to radiation. But then if we think further, women also usually are the main caretakers in societies around the world. It will be women who have the responsibility to take care of children that are ill, that suffer from birth defects, but also that are ill following the consequences of radiation. But they also have usually the responsibility to take care of the sick and the elderly. They usually are the main healthcare providers in hospitals and nursing homes and so on. And if you think about the social stigma that comes with that, the social stigma that comes with having a child with a birth defect, or having a stillborn, or suffering from infertility due to the consequences of radiation, there's a whole lot of suffering that is unseen. And why do we need to care about this? Well, it is one more thing, one more factor to help us consider what we really talk about when we contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. And I hope that in the minds of the people who matter, who make those decisions in the worst case, that will promote restraint, because they are more aware of what it truly is that they would be inflicting upon generations and generations of people. But I also want to mention another example that is perhaps.
Well, before you do, I want to reply to that, because that's really important. One of the most striking examples we have of gendered effects of nuclear radiation is from the Chernobyl disaster, where one woman in particular survived because her unborn child basically absorbed the radiation that would have killed her. And I mean, just when you think about that, just the levels of devastation that are in there. So, Ukraine has particular previous experience with the horrors of radiation, which makes even more unconscionable Russian threats against nuclear power plants in Ukraine. The idea that they would weaponize not just nuclear weapons, those threats are terrible in and of themselves, but the threats to civilian reactors to unleash another Chernobyl-like incident in Ukraine itself, it boggles the mind that these people have had to suffer so much, and that another reminder, exactly as you said, of the absolute horrors of radiation and what it can do to women, and then what that can do to society as well, and the stigma and years of either acknowledgement or denial of the effects of the radiation from Chernobyl, still something that we talk about today.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think this is perhaps hasn't featured so prominently in the conversation around nuclear installations in Ukraine when we talk about the 7 pillars that the IAEA has proposed. Right. When we talk about establishing a security zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, I think, and there again, I think there's this dynamic where we just, as humans, have a hard time engaging with thoughts that are that uncomfortable and horrifying. But it is important, and it is important to illustrate the full scale of what it means to issue a threat against a nuclear installation. And in the development of the international narrative, the global conversation around the safety and security of nuclear installations in conflict zones, I think we probably need to put more emphasis on severity of targeting those installations. Absolutely. In terms of international law, international humanitarian law.
Yeah, and hats off to Rafael Grossi himself for getting so involved in that, in the 7 pillars, and his personal interventions to try to keep that power plant safe. He's doing excellent work there in raising awareness and addressing, exactly as you said, the potential for a worst case scenario, and trying to take that off the table and keep nuclear power plants out of conflict.
I just wanted to bring up another example of how gender considerations are important in disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control. And you might be quite familiar with this, William, because it's the NATO CBRN defense policy that was updated in 2022.
Yes, very aware of
that. The first iteration, as you will know, was published in 2009. And after 2022, after that update, that was the first time that gender had made its way into that policy. And I know from colleagues that you also will be aware of and know very well, like Irini Lemos-Magnati, the deputy head of the Arms Control Disarmament of the, oh, sorry, I'm getting the acronym wrong, ACDC?
That's okay. It's Irini Lemos-Maniati, the Deputy Director of the NATO Arms Control, Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Center. She was my deputy. She's amazing. She's a force of nature. And she grabbed that policy herself when I was there and said, can I make a run at this? And nations were not in the mood. And that just made me want to do it more. And she and I had an agreement that we would make sure gender mainstreaming was part of everything we did. And bless her heart, I'm so glad you mentioned this. She did a really amazing work in putting that together. Thank you so much. That's I'm sure she deserves every credit for getting it through the nations.
I am just really glad you put respect on her name after I butchered it so terribly. I'm so sorry. I hope that she can forgive me.
We might edit that out.
Well, but I just want to use that example to highlight that gender perspectives, gender considerations aren't fanciful, because one of the considerations in the CBRN defense policy of NATO is that protective equipment to protect civilians, but also combatants against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons,
right,
is that protective gear needs to fit everyone, right? And statistically, it's just a fact that women tend to have smaller faces, different bodies, and just different requirements for protective gear to fit them properly. So we're not talking about something imaginary. We're not talking about liberal, progressive, woke ideology here. We're literally talking about, in the worst case, ensuring that fewer military personnel, first responders, civilians die because they will have better fitting protective gear.
Absolutely. Federica, any other thoughts?
No, I mean, we talked about this with Louis yesterday, and I'm so glad that he raised the example, because it's crazy if you think about it. I mean, you're doing your job, right? And you don't have the protective gear to do it well, and it's a very difficult job too. So,
well, I think
I'm very glad.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, just saying that I'm very glad that Louis brought up the example.
Okay. Mara, what about you? Do you have any thoughts?
I think my colleagues have covered a great deal here, but some things that I have is I'm really glad that my colleagues have highlighted not just the physical difference between the gendered impacts of weapons, but also the psychological ones. Because I feel like as you start talking about the gendered impacts, people often immediately think about, okay, what are the physical differences? How does it affect women and girls and boys and men differently? But there is an underlying psychological element. And I think the recent pandemic really brought this to the forefront, that you really can't neglect the psychological impact that these weapons could have on both genders and on a society at large in the aftermath of an incident. So I just really want to emphasize that point. One thing I would like to maybe just come back to is Federica mentioned briefly that there are a few treaties that have brought in a gender dynamic. Federica, maybe you want to expand on that, but I know also in these particular treaties that some of them are required, or state parties are required to provide age and gender sensitive assistance. And there's also a huge debate about the need for sex disaggregated data. And I pose the question kind of to my colleagues as well. Is this the type of information we need? I mean, the example that Louis gave was a really pressing one, because that's not just about data. That's just basic planning, right? You need to plan ahead. You need to have a gender perspective at every stage of implementation to be prepared for the worst case scenario. So I'm wondering, the treaties that have come out and they're making the link and they have gender language in them, oftentimes it is focused on assistance as well as data, but do we need more than that? Is it really, how do we get it at the actual planning phases, especially when we're dealing with some of these regimes that have been around for a while and gender is now just making its way into those discussions?
Well, I think obviously this is a very good first step, and I think it's problematic that only few treaties so far have been including gender language and victim assistance. But it's definitely a first step. Obviously, it's necessary to monitor implementations of all the commitments that are provided in these treaties. And it's interesting because we are also entering a phase, a historical phase, it seems, that doesn't believe too much in new treaties anymore, especially in arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. We've seen one after the other collapsing. So who knows when the next treaty will be agreed upon or implemented. But I think that mentioning, this is the entire goal of this talk, right? That we need to have gender perspectives also in this field. And so that's also a way to do that.
Yeah, I would think the assistance provisions in the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention are both good places where you're not going to reopen the agreements, but where at least in implementation you could bring gender perspectives in, and particularly as we talked about earlier, in terms of preparing first responders and setting standards for care would be really both important things to keep gender perspective in mind. Well, this has been an incredibly interesting topic and a complex one with lots of different aspects to it. I think the really most important thing is to continue to do studies and to raise awareness of the gendered impact, particularly of the complex weapons of mass destruction interactions between the victims and victim assistance, and psychological effects and long-term effects. So I want to thank you so much for raising awareness today. We'll also say that we're going to put links in the program notes for the reports that you've mentioned here and other useful resources for listeners. So Federica, thank you so much for the podcast today. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much, William. I'm very glad that the Arms Control Poseur is dedicating a chapter to this. So thank you so much for the invite.
And thank you, Mara, and thank you, Louis, as well. That's the end of part one. When we're back in a minute, in part two, we're going to talk to Federica about her life and times. Back in just a sec. All right, and welcome back to part two of the podcast. I am here with Federica Dall'Arche from
Dall'Arche.
Dall'Arche. Is that better? No.
It's okay. Don't worry. I'm used to it. Everybody butchers my name.
Damn it. I can't recall that L. Anyway, Federica, how are you doing? Great to have you here for part two, where I'm going to ask you about your life and times. So tell me, how old were you when you first really became aware of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological weapons? Were you, playing with little atom bombs when you were a child, or is this something that came to you later in your career during university? When did you really become aware?
Well, I'm not going to say how old I was because that will reveal my age. No, I'm just kidding. Nothing wrong with that. But I actually started to be aware of arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. No, let me take a step back. I started to be aware of nuclear weapons when I started my master's degree in Italy.
Okay.
And then I got so fascinated that I decided to get a master's degree specifically in non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and that's where my knowledge became a little bit deeper, and I started to be very interested in this topic. And that was
is that why you were attracted to? Well, no, we don't have to say how many years ago that is. Was that what attracted you to Middlebury,
Sorry?
or is that what attracted you to Middlebury College, or were you already going there and then you decided to specialize on that topic?
No. Actually, I took a class at Roma Tre University with Professor Marilena Gala, and her class was illuminating. It was called Nuclear Power in the Global System, or a title similar to that, which was eye-opening for me because I was an international relation and political science student. I had a BA already on that, But it was only until that class that I really realized how nuclear weapons really shape international relations. Like we can talk about, economy and whatever, but at the end of the day, I think that it's nuclear weapons that dictate what's happening. And so that made me very curious in the topic, and I decided to look for further my education on this, and I found online the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, MIS. And so I applied, and then the rest is history, I guess.
Were there other programs that you looked at, or was there something about Middlebury that attracted you?
Well, funny enough, there was nothing in Europe at the time.
Okay.
So it was very interesting also to see that there were only very few classes taught on this, but there wasn't a specific master's degree. And I think it was very similar in the United States. So at that time, at least, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey was the only one offering an entire degree on non-proliferation and terrorism studies, which was also something that I was very interested about at the time, because there were a lot of terrorist attacks, and that, the history of terrorism in Italy, it's pretty heavy, and so I was drawn by these two big topics in the masters.
And was there any, you mentioned your undergraduate professor who opened your eyes, were there any professors at Middlebury that really stood out for you?
Yeah, of course. Dr. Potter, which I'm sure you know,
Bill Potter,
yeah, Bill Potter, who was a fantastic mentor. But there were so many classes. I remember I took a lot of classes on non-proliferation finance, for instance, that were incredible. Classes on Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, proliferation issues. To be honest, I don't get anything from sponsoring this, but getting this degree was like one of the best decisions of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll ask Bill to write you a check. That's good. No, so when you graduated, what did you do?
Well, when I graduated, I obtained a fellowship at the WILF, which is the Women International League for Peace and Freedom. And so from Monterey, I moved to New York, where I worked on issues related to arms control, non-proliferation, monitoring of implementations and commitments towards arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. But that's also where my interest in gender studies started. And so it was right there that I started to do the connection between arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament and gender studies. And it was an incredible experience, for sure.
How long were you there?
Well, the fellowship was supposed to last a bit longer, but I was only there for 6 months, and then because I got another fellowship actually at Pacific Forum. At the time, Pacific Forum was paired with CSIS, so Pacific Forum CSIS. Now it's only Pacific Forum. And then I stayed at Pacific Forum for almost 2 years doing nuclear security issues and nuclear safety, but most security, actually.
Okay. And so then what happened? Did you see this job in Vienna, or was there something else in between?
Oh, no. Then from Pacific Forum, which was in Hawaii and was amazing.
Is that with David Santoro?
Yeah, he was my direct boss. And
he's a great guy.
If he's listening, maybe not, but if he's listening, hi, David. I had an amazing time there, and I wish I could stay longer, But
so hardship posts so far: Monterey, New York, and Hawaii. All right.
Yeah, and then from there I went directly to London. I worked for Deloitte a little bit, Deloitte UK. So I actually switched career a little bit. I shouldn't say, because I stayed in the field. I was doing export control, but but yeah, I think I quickly realized that the private sector wasn't too much for me. And so I received an offer to go back to my country and work for the Istituto Affari Internazionali. And so basically I did Rome, Monterey, Monterey, New York, New York, Hawaii, Hawaii, London, London, Rome. I stayed in Rome for 3 years and a half, and then I decided to come to Vienna.
Wow.
And
Was there a
before-
job, or did you just say, Vienna, I am arriving, accommodate me as you will?
Well, no, not really. The fun fact is that while I was at the Istituto Affari Internazionali and I was working under the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, Elena and I from the VCDMP, Elena Sokova, Executive Director of the VCDMP, decided together with Mara and Ettore Greco, decided to establish the Young Women Next Generation Initiative, which is under the consortium. And so we established this initiative together, and this is an initiative that we've established because we, at the time, realized that there was a huge gender and age imbalance in, major conferences and related to arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And so we decided to create something that could proactively do something to engage the next generation and young women specifically. And so we created this initiative that has that includes webinars and skill building opportunities for the younger generation, gives them a platform to present the research. And we also created a mentorship program specifically to young women. So every year we select about 20 women from all over the world, and we pair them with high-level experts in the field. So we've established this while I was at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and then my contract with the institute was coming to an end. And so Elena was like, hey, why don't we continue what we started together from the VCDMP? And that's how I got here.
Wow, that's great. And what do you focus on now? What are your major work areas right now?
Well, a little bit of everything, I would say.
Yeah.
I've just recently published a chapter on a book, with Polina Sinovets and Aderito Vincente. And the chapter was specifically on gender perspectives in arms control. I've also analyzed the impact of the war in Ukraine from a gender perspective, but the book in general is a book on the war that Russia waged against Ukraine. But as I said, a little bit of everything. I'm also consulting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so that gave me the opportunity to cover the MPT recently, being part of the Italian delegation, and the IIGC. I guess
Wow.
a little bit of everything.
That is great. That is just wonderful. So let me wrap up by asking you a final question. If you could go back at any point in your life and give yourself advice on your career, what to do, how to do things differently, maybe better, maybe the same, whatever advice you would give yourself, what would you say?
That's a good, difficult question. So what advice would I give myself? Well, on one hand,
was there a point where if you knew something then, what you know now, it would just be so useful? Just if somebody were to say to you, "Hey, don't worry about this, or do this more, or do that less," anything like that.
Well, I would say I worried a lot about the future. I worried a lot about, okay, what's my next step? What I'm going to do? Will I be able to, sustain my life? Because, as a researcher, that's always a question that you have. So maybe I would say to myself, work hard as you're doing, but don't worry too much because things fall into places. And, I don't know. I think I need to think about this a little bit more. But but I think that's that's the one thing that I would say. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. And I want to thank you once again for being on the podcast. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on gender and arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation. And also thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. I've learned a lot, and I'm very grateful that you're on the podcast. So thank you, Federica.
Thank you so much, William. It's been such an amazing pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. That wraps us up. See you next time on the Arms Control Poseur podcast.
I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again.